Okay, I think that's my cue to start. So our first speaker of the session will be Natalia Kudriavtseva. I hope I'm saying that correctly.
Yes, exactly.
From Kherson National Technical University. And she'll be talking about implementing revitalization ideologies in Ukrainian language learning material.
Yes, thank you very much. Let me start my presentation. Can you see it?
Yes, we can see it.
Okay. So hello everyone, my name is Natalia, I'm from Ukraine. I'm going to speak about revitalization of the Ukrainian language. And specifically, I will concentrate on the online language learning materials. Studies on language ideologies in revitalization contexts have clearly demonstrated the fact that there is a multiplicity of ideological frames which coexist and collide in the process of language renewal. Researchers have pointed out two distinct ideological complexes that underpin the authority of a language, that is, its right to be respected and used. These two are often referred to as authenticity and the terms. Can I go on?
Yes, I've muted the speaker who had their mic on accident.
The terms used to capture the notion of a language's value, while they're also known as the romantic and the rationalist models, which relate to the historical traditions they originated in. The ideology of authenticity is a conception which usually grounds the revitalization of endangered and minoritized languages. Under this view, the value of a language is derived from its relationship to a particular community, compared to Ernštreits' language as identity marker view. By contrast, anonymity is the conception on which dominant languages often rest, as they are presented to be universally available, what Ernštreits terms language as a communication tool. The major difference is accurately described by Catherine Woolard as coming from somewhere versus coming from nowhere. In her case study of Catalan language revitalization in Catalonia, Woolard argues that authenticity and identity values, once secure in the language survival under conditions of subordination, now constrain its acquisition and use, and that Catalan has to loosen its tie to an ascriptive ethnic identity if it was to be spread effectively to all. The value of authenticity was also reported to hinder language renewal in the cases of other European minority languages, indigenous languages of North and South America, and in many other revitalization contexts where the discourse of authenticity has also been divisive. Research on new technologies used to enhance the process of language renewal, as well as on technologically enabled indigenous language pedagogies, shows their powerful potential to expand the endangered language use to new domains and settings. This is an essential aim of language revitalization, understood as bringing the language forward to new users and uses. Nevertheless, some ideologies which negatively impact language maintenance can still be traced in modern online technologies, seen as the new frontier of language revitalization. For instance, a study by Irina Wagner of native North American language learning websites shows that such counterproductive ideologies as elder purism, whereby language is presented as an echo of the past, correctness, linguistic homogeneity, compartmentalization of language, and reification of language, are not unique to classroom instruction, but often are reiterated online. Together with the ethno theories of revalorization of languages sacred, these views make up the ideological complex of authenticity, or the language's identity view. By contrast, productive ideologies seek to depict language in a non-stereotypical way, by transcending the notion that it belongs to somebody in particular, by strengthening its communicative use, and by extending language learning to broader contexts. As Woolard puts it, language has to be perceived as an unmarked choice, as pretty much everyone's language, in order to become widely used. This means its ideology needs to evolve in the direction of anonymity. The Ukrainian language has long had a literary standard and a state language status since 1989, and technically it cannot be referred to as an endangered language. Still, its suppression under Russian imperial rule and the immigration in the times of the Soviet Union have brought an extensive shift to Russian, particularly in Ukraine's southeast, which you see as highlighted in yellow. It was namely in this part of the country that during the 18th to 20th centuries, the Russification policy has been most extensive, and Ukrainian was, to a considerable extent, forced out of use. In independent Ukraine, Ukrainian is the sole official language, but it is far from dominant in communication. Consequently, the state's efforts to encourage a more widespread use of Ukrainian are often studied under the paradigm of Ukrainian language revitalization, since the state's enterprise seeks to revalue Ukrainian and grant it prestige, which is a primary task of language revitalization movements. As Lada Bilanyuk and Svetlana Melnik put it, the Ukrainian situation is one where the titular language, that is Ukrainian, was effectively minoritized and thus endangered under the Soviet regime. The representation of Ukrainian as an endangered language is a fundamental tenet of the hegemonic language ideology for Ukrainian. The ideology that specifies an intrinsic link between ethno-national identity and language naturalized under the authenticity framework. This entails a negative view on the current situation of Ukrainian-Russian bilingualism, a purist stance in the standardization of Ukrainian, valorization of correctness and the concept of beauty in language, and the overall unacceptance of any kind of linguistic hybridity, exemplified in the deprecation of Ukrainian-Russian mixed variety, which we here call surjik. In this discourse, Russian-speaking Ukrainians, conceived as primary targets of the Ukrainian revitalization project as the potential new speakers, are delegitimized, shamed, and stigmatized as the hapless victims of Russification, as Aneta Pavlenko puts it, who betrayed their mother tongue Ukrainian and speak the foreign Russian language. As a result, increasing Ukrainian medium schooling, which since independence has been actively promoted by the state, has not brought any significant change in everyday language use among Russian-speaking Ukrainians, as it contributed only to the compartmentalization and reification of the language. However, what did bring a change was the event of the 2013-2014 years known as the Ukraine's Euromaidan. You may have heard about it. The Euromaidan protests and the following Russian occupation of the Crimean Peninsula and the easternmost parts of the country known as Donbass provoked a shift of self-perception among Ukrainian people, which Volodymyr Kulik called a popular drift away from Russianness among Russian speakers in the direction of hybrid or layered identification. This involved cases of linguistic conversion among ethnic Ukrainians, as well as ethnic Russians living in Ukraine. That is a conscious switch from Russian to Ukrainian in everyday communication, pointing to a building trajectory for the inclusive civic rather than ethnic identity, a reappreciation of the Ukrainian-Russian mixed variety surjik that came to be seen as the language of protest against the existing social order, and what is of interest in my study, a growing popular demand for opportunities to learn Ukrainian among the adult speakers of Russian in Ukraine. Such an unprecedented opportunity is the language course Ukrainian in 27 lessons, a free online resource launched in April of 2020 and designed specifically for Russian-speaking Ukrainians, including those residing in the now occupied territories of Crimea and Donbass. The course is suggested as the elementary level A1, A2, It consists of video lessons accompanied by transcripts, tasks, tests, and additional resources, and is intended for around 1 to 3 months of intensive work. Besides exploring ideologies in the course materials, I also conducted a series of in-depth interviews with the course developers and instructors. This data were analyzed in the framework of Kathleen Riley's approach to ideologies and language socialization, which identifies the following 3 types: language acquisition ideologies, semiotic and contextual usage ideologies, and ideologies of the value of linguistic forms. Incorporating this typology within the anonymity of the framework, which I have already spoken about, we'll get the following kinds of ideologies. Language acquisition ideologies. Language can only be naturally acquired, as first language is effortlessly acquired from birth in the authenticity framework, versus language can be learned by anyone who puts an effort. Semiotic and contextual usage ideologies. Language is associated with a particular identity, versus languages ideologized as non-ethnic, as not belonging to any particular community or group of people. And ideologies of the value of linguistic forms. We have purism is valorized, hybrid and non-standard varieties are not accepted in the framework of authenticity, versus linguistic hybridity is tolerated and multilingualism is praised. Employing discourse analysis of the data, I find evidence of diverse language ideologies coexisting, which may confirm or resist the hegemonic stance. And the hegemonic stance, I'm reminding you, was in the language as identity framework. In keeping with the language as identity view is the association of Ukrainian with Ukrainian territory and culture. As you can see from these examples on the slide, here's the very first sentence in the course description, which is highlighted in yellow. Here is a translation in inverted commas, and then there are some more examples from transcripts, which I also translated from Ukrainian into English. However, and this is where the ideologies begin to deviate, this identification function is seen as secondary, derived from the primary function of Ukrainian as a means of communication. This is about communication, about use, about living language in the first place, as one of the course developers says in her interview. The online course targets a wide audience of people who use Russian at home or at work, but want to become more fluent in Ukrainian for everyday use. And here is another sentence in the course description, which explains the target audience of this course. This means that by putting enough effort, those learning Ukrainian are able to successfully acquire the language on their own. And this is first cardinal difference from the hegemonic ideology for the Ukrainian language. This further conforms with the language acquisition ideology of additive bilingualism, which means that Ukrainian in this case, that Ukrainian, yes, a second language, which is Ukrainian in this case, is understood as an extra resource in our linguistic repertoire, which comes in as an important addition, while the first language is also maintained. So no one expects you to forget Russian altogether, as the hegemonic ideology requires us to do, but sees Ukrainian as a very useful extra resource which you add to the linguistic repertoire you already have. And this is manifested in Russian language translations. These are highlighted in yellow in the course materials. Translations of separate words and phrases in the video transcripts, and Russian equivalents accompanying thematic vocabulary. Ukrainian is a resource for new opportunities. It is a language of success, says one of the course instructors. In the process of learning Ukrainian, the knowledge of Russian is perceived as a tool. And one of my interviewers used a very apt metaphor. She said, Russian is like a crutch that helps you sort of walk to Ukrainian. This pragmatic acceptance of translanguaging implies an ideological embrace of multiplicity, which links to an ideology of the value of linguistic forms that bilingualism, multilingualism is an asset. Speak as many languages as you can, but also learning Ukrainian, says one of the course instructors, At the same time, pragmatic code-switching tolerance does not verge into an ideology that promotes the production of mixed varieties, such as surgic. As I already said, surgic is very much denigrated in Ukraine. It is seen as a language of uneducated people, and all the bad negative associations come with it. So non-standard...
Natalia,
yes?
5 minutes left.
Thank you, thank you. Non-standard varieties, dialects, and mistakes arising out of mixing are tolerated, but are sought to be prevented before being actually made. Mistakes are okay. Surgic is Ukrainian language. Dialects are okay. These are also Ukrainian. Slang is okay. It's also Ukrainian language, says one of the course developers. The prevention is revealed in grammatical explanations. And here you see highlighted grammatical terms, grammatical explanations, and of abounding in specific grammatical terms, as well as phonetic and semantic differentiations of homonymous vocabulary in order to pinpoint similarities and differences between Ukrainian and Russian. We emphasize the differences between Ukrainian and Russian. It's easier to learn Ukrainian like that, says another course instructor. So contrary to the hegemonic view, the acquisition of Ukrainian is conceptualized within the frame of anonymity, which is paired with the positive appreciation of multilingualism under the same frame. In terms of the semiotic and contextual usage ideologies, it should be noted that the notion of identity undergoes a transformation. If under the, so to say, classic authenticity, identity was naturalized, that is, was seen as biologically given, you had to be born into this Ukrainian language surroundings and hear it from your very birth to be able then to speak Ukrainian beautifully and correctly. In this online course, identity is posited as something that can be acquired through effort. In this way, identity becomes inclusive, and as Catherine Woolard puts it, the definition of the self shifts from origins to goals. In Woolard's account is where the ideology of authenticity breaks with naturalism and remains still relevant, understood as project authenticity. And finally, what is more important is that this approach to authenticity meets the recent shift of self-perception among Ukrainian people. The shift towards the understanding that identity is something that can be consciously embraced. Another important takeaway of this study is that the values of authenticity and anonymity, which I started with, do not have to be seen as mutually exclusive. It's not either authenticity or anonymity as an ideology for the language you want to promote. As Bernadette O'Rourke puts it, rather they make up a continuum. On this continuum, there are different ideological stimuli corresponding to different stages in the revitalization process. At the stage when Ukrainian was subordinated, during the times of the Russian Empire, the identity value worked well to secure the language survival and legitimize its use. But at the next stage, when the legitimacy of Ukrainian is not anymore questioned, and there is a growing demand for it among the speakers of Russian, it is crucial to make this next step, from the step away from the extreme of naturalist authenticity and towards anonymity in order to effectively bring the language to potential new speakers. This is the time for what Paul Kraskriti termed ideological clarification, which is indispensable in any revitalization project, and which I think has already been done in the case of this online course of the Ukrainian language. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Natalia. So if there are any questions, we would to put them in the general chat. I will type in right now to hopefully give you a notification.
So I'm still waiting for the questions, right?
Yes, we're just waiting for a couple to come in, I think.
So in case you wanted to know about how close Ukrainian and Russian are, yes, and I said the main point of this course was to teach Ukrainian through comparison Ukrainian and Russian and saying what is similar between them and what is different. So they are in fact closely related languages. They both belong to East Slavic languages, share many grammatical and lexical features, but in terms of vocabulary, they are quite different. They differ by 38%. In comparison, Spanish and Portuguese differ by 25%, Spanish and Italian by 33%. So in terms of vocabulary, they are in fact different languages. But in terms of grammar, it's really useful to learn Ukrainian, if you already know Russian, to learn Ukrainian by comparing Ukrainian features with the features of the Russian language.
So I have a question related to that. How mutually intelligible are they then?
It's difficult for me to say because it will be subjective, but what opinion, I speak both Russian and Ukrainian, and Russian is my first language, is the language of my childhood, my family, and Ukrainian comes as second language. So it's also my personal interest in this study. I have a personal interest in this. But judging from what other people say, for example, Russians, they cannot understand Ukrainian. If you say a separate word in Ukrainian, and it will be similar to a Russian word, then they will understand if it is similar in pronunciation. But if it is a speech flow, if it is a couple or more sentences, then no, they are lost because of the different vocabulary. They lose the grammatical structures and cannot understand. So it seems that they are similar. And in fact, during the Soviet times, the Soviet ideology for the Ukrainian language was to make it more similar to Russian. And it was one of the main features of the standardization of this Ukrainian language. But in fact, they are not so similar and they are not quite mutually intelligible.
Thank you. We have a question from Julia Salabank. She asks, what are people's motivation for learning Ukrainian? Does the link with roots come into it, i.e. a more authenticity-oriented orientation?
Thank you. This is a very interesting question because this is the biggest point about learning Ukrainian today. What I can say from these interviews and what I can say from my participant observation of other groups, which the material didn't include in the study, this is the motivation of identity. So the first reason for learning Ukrainian that they name is that they want to feel more Ukrainian. They want to feel that they belong to this country. And they want to show that they sort of do something for Ukraine in this way. Yes, it might sound strange, but in these current circumstances, when there is a war, Ukraine is at war with Russia and parts of Ukraine's territory are occupied, people feel greater responsibility, and at the same time, they want to distance from Russia, from this country, and from some of its people. They want to take some distance, and they choose Ukrainian to show that they are Ukrainian people. Then there are some other cases when people have very pragmatic motivation. They need this language because they want to apply for a better job, and there both the knowledge of Russian and Ukrainian is necessary. But the biggest and the most frequent motivation that I noticed is authenticity. Yes, but this is not authenticity that is coming from roots. It's not finding my roots. It's projecting. It's making myself becoming a better, making a better self, if it's possible to say so, making a better person of oneself. Maybe there is one more question.
Yes, there is one more question from Heather Sparling. Heather, could you unmute yourself if you'd like to ask it yourself?
Sure. Yeah, I was just really interested in this emphasis on the living language piece. And so I was just curious to what extent that ideology translated from the context of the course to their lives beyond the course. So do you know whether students who did the language course were successfully able to communicate in Ukrainian after the course? Did they begin to use Ukrainian more in a range of contexts and domains?
Some of the students, in fact, switch to Ukrainian because there is this growing tendency of, as Latvia Belk puts it, conversion, linguistic conversion. So people consciously switch from Russian to Ukrainian, and these people are not necessarily Ukrainians by birth. They may be Russians living in Ukraine. So people, yes, are conscious, and they put a lot of effort into speaking Ukrainian. Again, some people have bigger motivation because they need it for work, and then they have more opportunities to use the language because they are required to use the language at work, for example. But I know in the group that I am observing currently, there are people who switch into Ukrainian because they feel that they should do it. It's a very interesting process to observe when people decide to switch into language. And it's really, languages are close, but they are different languages. And it's really difficult, especially in Russian in the southeastern Ukraine, where you have Russian speaking surrounding. It's really difficult to go and speak in Ukrainian when everyone else speaks Russian and everyone perfectly understands you. So why bother? But people, yes, there are some people, not many of them, there are not so many people who really switch into Ukrainian their everyday lives. But I think I need a longitudinal study to give you more details about it. But there are definitely such people who switch, and they influence their relatives, their family members to switch into Ukrainian. So they do not, people stopped waiting for these surroundings to appear. They started to make their own language surroundings. So they start to convert people into Ukrainian. And the ideology of the course is that do not give up. If you suggest, if you come to a bar and you start speaking Ukrainian, and then somebody says, oh, just give up, just speak Russian, everyone understands you. Just do not give up, just go on, just do not take notice. And these instructors, they really work a lot on the psychological moments, because they say our biggest problem is the psychological barrier. Is to show people that it's not so difficult in the first place, and to show people that it's good. Nobody will think anything, or nobody will associate it with nationalist ideology, as the Ukrainian language sometimes is associated with nationalism, ethno-nationalism. It's much better than it was before the Euromaidan in 2014. And it's remarkable that it's not so much the state's effort, it's not so much the Ukrainian language schooling, and today we have 100% Ukrainian language schooling in Ukraine from September 1, 2020. But it's these events which made this shift in the people's consciousness. People understood finally that Ukraine is a separate country, it's not a part of Russia, and probably we should speak our own language, not Russian. So it's inspiring.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Natalia. That was a really great talk. There's several messages of thanks in the chat as well.
Thank you.
So I think we will move on to our next talk, which will be Valts, Ernštreits, and Gunta, Kļava from the University of Latvia, presenting a talk entitled "Can Christmas Gifts Ensure Language Acquisition? Experiences with Teaching Livonian." And just as a reminder, if you have any questions for the speakers, please enter them in the chat.
Okay, hello everyone, and greetings from Riga and Latvia. So today we will really try to offer you a glimpse of experiences with teaching Livonian, and we just discussed that it actually covers a period of almost 100 years since founding of Latvia, and all the way up until today. So but probably we should start with telling you a little bit about who Livonians are, because it is somehow that small that many of you might have not be heard about them before. So Livonians are Finno-Ugric nation, and Livonian is Finno-Ugric language, which is indigenous to Latvia. And it's currently one of the world's most endangered languages. It's listed also in UNESCO Atlas of the World Languages in Danger. And currently we could say that approximately 30 individuals can communicate in Livonian, and according to last census, about 250 individuals gave their ethnicity as Livonians. There are several reasons actually for that. So if you look at the map, you can see here are some Finnic languages and also Hungarian, which is also Finno-Ugric language. And you can see this very small green area for Livonian. However, that is Livonian former area that existed up until 50s. So currently situation has a little bit changed. Although Livonians used to inhabit quite large part of Latvia in the early 20th century, they stayed in a string of coastal fishermen villages in the northern coast of Latvia. And at that time, 100 years ago, there were approximately 1,000 Livonian speakers. And say in last 200 years, Livonians have not been very many either. So in mid-19th century, there were approximately 2,500 Livonian speakers. So it really is a very small language. However, it has to prove that it's quite vital with those numbers staying surviving for more than 200 years and being spoken even today. So during the Soviet occupation, because of this isolated Livonian area became outer border of the Soviet Union, Livonian population was expelled because their traditional livelihood was forbidden. So currently, Livonian speakers and Livonians themselves are scattered all around the Latvia. So basically, we could say that Livonians are not only one of the most endangered languages in the world, probably, but also one of the most challenged, because there is a very small number of speakers. There is no area. There is people are scattered all around, and there are very few resources that we can actually use for teaching Livonian and for Livonian acquisition. So for the first time in history, Livonian was offered in schools in 1920s, and it was elective course for those schools being primary schools being in this Livonian coast, in those fishermen villages. And the first problem that emerged already then was that were not sufficient people with skills to become teachers, and also all the other problems like having not standardized language, having no teaching materials, having no previous experience of teaching something like that. And to add to all of that, the teacher that was chosen for teaching Livonian in those schools came from the least spoken Livonian variety, and even these 1,000 speakers that were then, so there were number of varieties, and definitely not the biggest was chosen. So, and that caused first problem for kids attending lessons, which was that the language that they spoke home differed largely from what was spoken in schools. Also, another problem was that these classes were made up from mixed children. So there are kids to whom Livonian was home language. There were kids who partially spoke Livonian. There were even Latvian kids who wanted to study Livonian. So there was a big variety on the level of proficiency of the language itself. Because of that, to encourage the participation of Livonians, in these lessons. So Livonian supporters in Estonia and in Finland started to collect Christmas gifts. So it's kind of a material feature to stimulate those students learn and go to these lessons. But soon enough, they realized that actually those Christmas gifts don't work. When you talk, when you listen to those people attending those courses at that time, so the story is that because these were Christmas gifts, so amount of students coming to these lessons increased dramatically a couple of weeks before Christmas and decreased just after them. So this was the reason why since 1931 they ceased to collect money for gifts and gifts themselves and donated all the money into special fund that was meant for creating and publishing Livonian language reader, which was done in 1935. However, with the Soviet occupation in 1940, Livonian language instruction ceased in all the schools entirely. And it continued again in 1989. It was a period of awakening in all the post-Soviet space. So the first Livonian language classes began, but the problem was increased now because what I told previously, that Livonian community did not have the territory anymore. So they were living in separate, in all across Latvia, but mainly in the capital of Latvia, Riga, and then Ventspils on the western shore of Latvia. And here was the same problem. So there were classes with very mixed students, with very different language proficiency, and also different reasons for learning language. For some it was heritage language, for some it was language of the ancestors, and for some it was language that they just simply wanted to learn. And there were other challenges also, like again, because of the small number of language speakers, so you didn't have sufficient amount of instructors, and it was in very many cases, especially in end of 80s and 90s, there was the situation that those courses, there were several attempts to teach those courses, but they started over and over again each year from the same point that they did previously. And also those teachers were actually traveling 200 kilometers to perform a teaching lesson. So it went even so far that in Ventspils, which is the western biggest community for Livonians, they even refused to accept those courses of language because they just said that, okay, we can drink coffee on ourselves. We don't need a teacher to be presented at these lessons. So the only what we can say successful attempt to retain regular Livonian study of Livonian is annual Livonian Children and Youth Summer Camp. It takes place, it's about 10 days in the summer on the Livonian coast in the historical area, where kids from all living all across Latvia come together, and it's primarily meant for keeping their identity, but also studying Livonian language has always been part of that program, and also experiencing the same basic problems that have been experienced earlier, but what's the between those camps which take place annually, actually no opportunities exist for studying Livonian.
Yeah, so and as we can see, some steps have been taken, but still the use of Livonian in real communication in real life is very occasional, limited by poor language skills and more symbolic in nature. So often it's just like some greeting phrases and similar. And one of the tasks of our institute is also to research the field of language acquisition from theoretical point of view, and to foster also the activities for acquisition of language. And as our first step was a small preliminary research on the problems of bringing the Livonian to life. And we found out that it's possible to identify some main reasons why sometimes this work is not as effective as one would like, taking into account the evolution of language acquisition theory during last decades. And in fact, we can see that main issues are very basic in nature from the theoretical viewpoint and in the context of bigger languages or languages taught in school or taught for different audiences. And if we think or if we look at what is different, so in simple words, I would say that it's clear methodology and professional language teachers with pedagogical skills. And in this pre-research, we have asked various people involved in the maintaining of Livonian language and culture their opinion about current situation, and summarizing the data, like 4 main issues can be identified. So we can see them now in the presentation. And based on this, in 2020, we started implementation of a postdoc project. And in short words, the main idea is to seek possibility to adapt approach very well known in the world, taking into account the situation of very small languages as Livonian. So, and here we speak not only about very small number of speakers, but also insufficient domains of language use. And here I mean like very basic situations of language use. So for example, it's not possible to use, to speak these small languages in shop or airport or in the bus and even in families. So, and as well as language standardization issues and other social linguistic and linguistic properties. And now we are in our first stage in which we gather information about the results of questionnaire and interviews with Livonians and other peoples related to Livonian language maintenance, as well as observations of practice. And maybe about first conclusions of interviews we will speak a little bit later, but now we will look more at the practical activities which were done already.
So in 2020, Institute began researching Livonian language learning process, and we have been taking ourselves participating in Livonian children and youth summer camps work, and also we tried last year a first attempt to somehow to build the bridge and to build the connecting lessons between those 2 annual children camps, but actually we stuck quite fast with the same teaching problems that took place also before. But the point was actually also to stuck at these problems, to find out what the problems are and how to actually overcome them, and what is the main problem and what are just technical problems that can be solved.
Yeah.
And so?
So, and as a result of our interviews and especially observations, we can identify 6 main so-called directions or principles. So first of all, we have to define our target groups. And there are some, for example, there are some people who need Livonian just for singing in some ensemble, for example. And their need is very specific and more related to language standardizations. So how to pronounce words or forms and so on. Then there are families, kids, adults, also teachers who actually are not teachers. They are just activists with language level A2 or B1 and so on. So second important aspect is content. and it means like appropriate for target group and sequential from language teaching and learning aspect. There is no
just 5 minutes left.
There is no modern learning materials as books at all. Especially problematic situation is with teachers. Here I mean both knowledge of language and even more pedagogical skills. Of course, language has to be modern, including derivation of new words and so on. But what shows our observations during this summer camp for kids and youth, and during some winter meetings, it seems that main problem for all involved organizers or implementers of different activities is to understand what are our goals or what are goals of current activity and how we can achieve these goals. So now being involved closer, especially in existing possibilities to learn Livonian, we are now also much closer to understanding what should be done. And a lot of ideas and work are now in progress.
Yeah, basically the main thing is actually, if we talk retrospectively, then actually the main thing is to understand what, and these are big questions. So this is what is the end of revitalization? So what is the direction that we are going? What is that we want language to do in the future? Because all the other things are actually solvable, even in Livonian case. We have, during the last year, worked quite a lot of developing various state mechanisms to somehow to ensure Livonian acquisition. And so one idea that we have come up is to use those Livonian language speakers to make a special program to involve them in creating content, in taking participation in teaching process, and also through this ensuring the language environment for those who are learning. We have also implemented a couple of solutions using modern technologies that actually help to solve logistics issue and a distance issue. Like one interesting project was during the COVID time, coronavirus time, that there was a big project in Latvia to create online-based content for all Latvian schools, and it was for the first time that Livonian was included in that as a lesson for whole Latvia. So we had to come up with a solution, and there was a project born, 7 lessons of Livonian, which is accessible online. It will be also shown in English. We'll drop the link afterwards. And digital language tools that are available, they can also actually solve quite a lot of questions. But the main question remains that you have to know, you have to understand where you are going, you have to understand the steps that you are going, and only then actually language acquisition can be possible, at least especially in case like Livonians, where it's very hard to find domains for using the language. So
2 minutes.
Conclusions, shortly. So if one is asking, are Christmas gifts a solution for motivating language learning? Perhaps. We have offered coffee and cookies for kids here, and they very much like that, but that doesn't make them to come back. So it's actually more of that, and for very small languages, especially like Livonian, there's much more motivation needed and vision of the future needed, because technical solutions that existed 100 years ago can be very much solved with what we have today in one or another way. And
actually we are doing this work, because we are creating now like Livonian handbook in our institute and making Livonian language corpora.
Yeah, and we are working on standardizing, we are working on language materials, etc. But the main thing that you need clearly set goals and tasks and system and movement towards the future, and clarity about what the future is for the language. So, and thank you.
Thank you very much, both of you. We have one first question from Christopher Mosley. If he'd like to unmute himself, he can ask.
Okay.
Hi, TNO. Just a question about the 30 speakers. Do you think you could say something about their age range?
There is like the age range is the diversity is quite great. So we have from technically mother tongue speakers to, and here like those 30 people we are talking about more or less people who can communicate. So we are not talking about A1
No, we are not talking about C1 and C2 level or like native language level, but we are starting from A1. So this age range is more, I don't know, some from 20 to 70. To 70.
Yeah, okay, right.
And if you like the basic knowledge of Livonian, of course, there are much more people. Even those to illustrate. So one number is 30 language speakers, and another number is 40 kids taking part in each summer school, which is actually it is disproportional.
It doesn't mean that they can speak Livonian. Yeah.
But these are those people who are actually interested, and well, if you take 250 Livonians and 30 language speakers, and then you have 40 kids actually learning it, and these are not all of them. So this is actually those who could participate and could manage and could also find the finance for that.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you.
We have I think 3 questions from Patricia Sangidor. Sorry for the pronunciation. Maybe you could choose one of them at this point, and you can unmute yourself if you would like.
Well, with the Finnish, I would say so. It's more distant than Finnish and Estonian, definitely, because it's separated earlier from Finnish group. Yes, there is a dictionary of Livonian, and there's currently it's online on some institute's webpage, but it is not English for now. So it's Livonian, Estonian, Latvian dictionary. And this is one of the projects that we are actually working on. So, and you can look up the dictionary in there, how to write school. I just dropped also in Livonian here. So these 3 questions. Well,
thank you. Those are very quick. The next question from Tienda Graaf, if you would like to ask on your own.
The answer is no. Estonia, especially Estonia, has contributed greatly in researching Livonians and Livonian language in particular. Teaching and learning of Livonian is done so mostly by the community itself up until quite lately. Now, during the past years, the situation has been changing a lot. So this year, it was first year that Livonian Children's Summer Camp received full grant from Latvian Ministry of Education and Science to help this summer camp. And there are plans that since next year, there will be also more attention paid to possibilities to learn Livonian language. But but this is actually a big problem, because if a kid would like to study Livonian, let's say in a school, which should be his or her indigenous rights, but it would be quite impossible, just because, again, so no teachers, no learning materials, and lots of other things missing. So this is very complex problem. So even you can't, like, by solving one aspect, you actually cannot solve the teaching process or language acquisition process as such, which is
And speaking about like language domains and language usage, I think we have to keep in mind that Livonian is language which are actually now more have like symbolic value. There is very I don't know who speak Livonian every day from morning to evening. No one, actually. yeah, it's more like symbolic value, and there is very, very few people, and that's why it's very important to do all this work.
Thank you. My question is also, are the students from Estonia or Finland coming to study the language and maybe also to speak it?
Well, yeah, I would say, so we are organizing an event called Livonian Summer University, which is directed specifically to motivating new researchers of Livonian in the first place. And of course, it comes along with proficiency in Livonian to a certain degree. And it actually has paid off. So there's two times has been this summer university where people all across the Europe, not only in Europe, students, yeah. We bring them to Livonian coast, and then they for 10 days practice and then return back home. But currently, so if up until 2010 there were 6 PhD works on Livonian language. So since 2010 there have been already 3 PhD works on Livonian, and currently there are 4 PhD on Livonian being written, and all of them are actually from this Livonian Summer University, who have like switched because of that and started to get interested in this subject.
And do you have newspapers or radio programs or something for communication deals? Is it used on internet, for instance?
Well, there was in 30s there was a newspaper monthly that came out. So currently there is no newspaper because it's just simply too expensive. There have been, although, several attempts to do so. What we currently have are several Facebook pages that use Livonian on daily basis when publishing news, and there is also homepage of Livonians.net, which is also working in Livonian language, and what we are currently developing also at the institute is Livonian language corpora to be accessible for also for language acquisition and language environment purposes. So, language environment is actually one big issue here in Livonian case, and this is the main reason why we chose I previously told about this language speakers involvement program that we want to do. So this basically the idea is because there are, as Gunta said, there are those people who speak Livonian on daily basis, but you can make people to be in that environment on daily basis. So you can put those with this very special skills. Like I sometimes say, it's easier to get good presidential candidate for Latvia than good Livonian speaker. But you can take these people, you can put them to work according to what they can. To work either with Livonian text, just write them over, or translate something. Or now we have ongoing project with 2 Livonian younger ladies who are songwriters and who will produce songs for kids in a YouTube format that we will put up, and this is also the first like pilot example of this idea of putting them or making their daily life being more connected with the language, and thus creating like start with small language bubbles, and then just grow them gradually.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you both. Well, thank you. Thank you both very much. I think we're out of time for questions at this point, but if there are other questions for our speakers, or if you'd like to kind of discuss Livonian further, then you're welcome to head over to the break room / test room, which is throughout the conference. Yes, it's time for me again. So thank you, Zoe, for sharing, and thank you for 2 excellent talks. I really enjoyed them, and I shall now stop the recording as well. Sorry, there we go.